Yet again, another horrific story. So, this is in Canada. Another horrific discovery of Indigenous children's remains. And so, there's a history behind this as well, which is very, very truth telling. And so, here we have a memorial for 215 children whose remains were discovered on the site of a former Kamloops Indian residential school in British Columbia. And so this is by Ian Austin. So Regina, okay, so I may not pronounce this name. So Regina Saskatchewan, a Canadian Indigenous group. Okay, on Wednesday I might not say that again because it's a long name. So it announced a horrific, shocking discovery of the remains of hundreds of children um, at a site of a former school in the province of, I will pronounce it again, Saskatchewan. It's the largest such discovery to date. And so it came weeks after the remains of 215 children that were found unmarked graves on the grounds of another former boarding school in the British Columbia. And so both schools were part of a system that took Indigenous children in the country from their families. So there's a history here. Sounds very familiar, so listen. They took Indigenous children in the country from their families, sometimes forced, and housed them in boarding schools. And a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission called the practice cultural genocide. Many children never returned home, and their families were given only vague explanations of their fates and none at all. Sometimes none at all. So, in a statement, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations said that the latest remains numbered in the hundreds and were the most significantly substantial to date in Canada, and it did not give an exact figure. So, the discovery was made in the Cowes Wesses First Nation at the or Marival. It's called Marival Indian Residential School, about 87 miles from the provincial capital of Regina. So it's the Federation's chief, Bobby Cameron, said that the group planned a formal announcement on Thursday. So there was always talk about speculation and stories, of course, but to see this number, it's pretty significant of a number, Cameron said. So it's going to be difficult and painful and heartbreaking at the same time. So the latest findings were also are likely to deepen the nation's debate over its history of exploiting indigenous peoples. So the discovery will refocus attention on horrors of schools where sexual, physical, emotional abuse were common practice, and the Truth of Reconciliation Commission found. And so when Justin Trudeau took office as the prime minister in 2015, he placed taking up the commission's 94 recommendation as his top priority. But progress has been slow, in part because some of them are beyond the federal government's control. So Cameroon and several other indigenous leaders say that they hope the discovery of the children's remains of their bodies will accelerate the process. And so the investigations into the fate of the missing children are a vindication for Canada's Indigenous people, whose oral histories suggesting that thousands of children had disappeared from the schools had often been met with skepticism. So there's no denying this. All of the stories told by our survivors are very true. And so Cameron said this, and so this is what the Catholic Church in Canada and the government in Canada of the day force on our children. And so think about that. And so this was coming from a Catholic church that this took place. And so it is unclear how many children were sent to these schools, never to return home. Disease, including the Spanish flu outbreak a century ago, often swept through an overcrowded school dormitories. And some children had died from exposure after escaping. And so the testimony by former students to the commission included accounts of incineration of bodies of infants born to girls who had been impregnated by priests and monks. And so the commission estimated about 4,100 children had vanished. And but an indigenous former judge who led the panel said in an email earlier this month that he had now believed that the number was a lot higher, well beyond 10,000. So the remains of 250 children were discovered in the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia, though the use of the ground penetrating radar, much like the MRI scan, the technology produces images of anomalies in the soil. So, an official of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations said the latest analysis, which relied on the same technology, began about 3 weeks ago, not long after the announcement of preliminary findings about the Kamloops school in Kamloops, or to Kamloops, Te Sweshbit Beck First Nation. So that's a harder name for me to pronounce. For those that you know how to pronounce it, you understand. But the search of the Kamloops school is still continuing. The First Nation leaders say that they expected the final report would increase the number of graves that they have found. So they anticipate more bodies would be found, or more people's remains of what once were, people would be found. And so when the commission attempted to look into the question of missing indigenous children, the conservative government at the time turned down its request for the money to finance the searches. So now several federal governments have offered to fund searches after the Kamloops discovery. So on Tuesday, the government announced that it would provide just under 4.9 million Canadian dollars, 3.9 million to indigenous communities in Saskatchewan to search for these graves. And so the provincial government previously committed 2 million Canadian dollars, 1.6 million. So in a statement, Scott Moe, Premier of Saskatchewan, predicted that the remains of more children would be found elsewhere as well. So sadly, other Saskatchewan First Nations will experience the same shock and despair as the search for graves continues, he wrote. So they're still searching for more bodies, which they suspect could possibly be a lot more than just hundreds. Sounds like thousands. And so, like Kamloops Marival School, which opened in 1899, was operated for most of the history by the Roman Catholic Church for the government of Canada. So a marked cemetery still exists on the grounds of a school which closed in 1997 and was subsequently demolished. So the commission, relying on testimony from former students and archival material, listed the Marival School as a likely site for unmarked graves. So the commission called for a papal apology for the role of the church, okay, and their doing, in which operated 70% of these schools. And so the rest were run by Protestant denominations. And so it goes on to say, but despite the personal appeal of Trudeau and to the Vatican, Pope Francis has still not taken that step. So they haven't really taken a step on this issue. But by contrast, the leadership of the United Church of Canada and country's largest Protestant denomination, they have taken a step and apologized for its role in running these schools in 1986. So former students of the Saskatchewan residential schools were particularly active in litigation against the government, resulting in financial settlements and establishing of a commission which heard testimony from more than 6,700 witnesses over 6 years, a 6 year period. So since the Kamloops announcement, Cameron said that he has been traveling around the province where farming and mining are major industries, looking at former school sites as well that were affiliated with this. So you can see with your pain eye the in, indent of the ground where these bodies are to be found. And so he said of some locations, and so these children are sitting there waiting to be found. So that's pretty much the article that's in the New York Times company. So it's sad because these are the histories that should also be incorporated in CRT, critical race theory, and why these things took place, why these incidences took place, what was going on, and what happened before, what happened, what's happening present, and what's happening in the future as a result of all of this. And this is yet but another painful chapter in our history. Um, and it's sad. Even though Canada is supposed to be looked at as a whole nother part of a whole independent of itself, it still very much rings true with what has gone on. You can't escape any of this, and sure there's other graves I've heard too that were mass graves that they have uncovered. Um, African American males. I know there was one where they had men who were incarcerated, and they found multiple bodies or multiple remains of what would have been bodies, and they were mass graves as well, and they uncovered that. And so this is part of the reckoning. It really is. That's what I would say. And so, okay, so where are we at here? Here in LA, California, we have been opening, but we might be looking at a new group of viruses. There's been talk that in the South, a lot of the people that are being infected and being hit with the virus is really hard are people who haven't been vaccinated, or people who are maybe their immune systems are compromised, or they're already very vulnerable. A lot of misinformation is still floating around. There's a lot of people who aren't vaccinated. They're trying to open schools. They're opening everything here in California, but still, there's a recall for Governor Gavin Newsom. What's happening here in California is very much a part of this reckoning, and everywhere, as a matter of fact, I feel like it's being impacted by this. You see, more homicides are going up, more shootings. There's also an extension, another month extension of the moratorium, which was set to end on the 30th of um, June, and it's supposed to go to all the way through July, is what I'm hearing. A lot of people had been evicted despite the protections that took place. There's been more homeless issues that has skyrocketed. The beaches have changed here in California. A lot of them have like homeless encampments, and now the people that live on the beaches. What's ironic is many, I guess I would say decades ago, some of these beaches used to have black residents, and there were white people who basically mobs who really tried to find ways, or people who tried to find ways to get rid of the black residents. These same beaches now are being taken over by groups of homeless encampments, and the same people who Now you have these people who, like, usually when people live closer to the coastline, it you have to pay a lot more. They're being um, in affected by, if not only the elements of the fact that the coastline is starting to have flooding, and you see where the waves are washing up really fast, could just like basically sweep their condos and their houses right back into the ocean, which is natural. Um, you also see homeless encampments, rows and rows of homeless encampments. If you go up and down Venice Boulevard here in California, you see rows and rows of homeless tents. Skid Row has exploded, and so now there's this fight. And so the people who are over those areas like Venice, they are trying to lay blame on the people who were running the city, basically saying that they're not doing enough to get rid of the homeless issue, um, or keep it at bay. And their issue is taken up as that is violent. It has become violent, so I must say that. And it's not, it doesn't go without the problems that persist, is that a lot of people don't have affordable housing, don't have places to go, or they had been ousted from their housing. Um, and now you have more people that are on the streets, so there's not really much room for people, so they try to find other places to set up their tents. So we've had issues with fires, even in the downtown area, where businesses catch fire because the embers from people trying to cook on outdoor grills. And so it's gotten bad. It's gone from bad to worse, pretty much. And so this right here, I know this, some of this stuff is at the end of this article, but it all plays a role in this whole reckoning issue. You know, you have all these issues going on, and then we have what we were celebrating, the opening of California, and now that could change possibly. It could get worse. We don't know how. It was stated that there wouldn't be any more closures because of the problems with the economy. Um, so, having said that, I'm going to let this video go, but this is not a surprise to me whatsoever, and I wouldn't be surprised if they found other bodies. And so this was what was meant to happen, is to find these remains and for people to step forward and and address these issues. And we have people that constantly run away from this, or they want to hide history. They don't want to talk about it. And so this is why this stuff keeps coming up. And why you're finding these bodies is not by accident. So having said that, I'm going to let this go. It's something to think about. Here you have all of these issues that are happening all at once. And this is truly not going to end, because you still have people who are set in their ways, and they want to keep things the way they used to be by not talking about it and not discussing it and hiding the history rather than dealing with it head on. There's been people who have benefited, unfortunately, from this history, and others who have suffered from this history. And so that is what we're talking about right now. And we still have people suffering, and we see it all around us. And it's not going to go away unless the situations are dealt with. So having said that, I'm going to let this video go. Thanks for listening.